welcome here and thank you for being here, for joining force with White Hat and experience in the aviation. Maybe first as a context, what is this presentation about? Safety always has been and will always be the top priority for the aviation industry. As the increased connected ecosystem brings in new risk, potential risk, it is very important to engage with the White Hat hacker community so that vulnerability can be detected early, mitigated, and guarantee further the safety of crew and passenger, as well as guaranteeing that there is no impact on financial reputation of a company. So really extensive engagement with the White Hat hacker community is very important. Was it an easy process? No. Considering that it was previously a really totally segregated environment, the bringing of E-enabled aircraft changed the landscape and pushed us to engage with White Hat community, but it was a long process before it raised in maturity. Today's panelists will explain that roadmap to you. They will explain how they set up or joined a vulnerability disclosure program, explain some use case and how they eventually address some vulnerability, but also explain what is the relation with the media about vulnerability, and as well as a closure, how they can share what they have learned with the community. I would like first the panel to present himself. Deneen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Deneen DiFiore. I'm the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at United Airlines. I've been there for about 3 years. Prior to that, I kind of grew up in GE Aviation. So both the OEM side, supplier side, and now on the operator side.
Brian.
Good morning, everyone. Brian Conley, Vice President and Chief Engineer for Product Security at the Boeing Company. My role is looking at security and resiliency of our products across our both defense, commercial, and our services portfolios. Been with Boeing about 4 years. Prior to that, I was with Department of the Navy, did a similar role for NavAir for naval aviation. So government side and now on the commercial side.
Ken.
Hi there, my name's Ken Monroe. I'm a pen tester and a pilot. I work for a firm called Pen Test Partners. Our interest is in embedded system security and unusual protocols. So it's all the things that you'll find in airplanes, ships, vehicles, and other interesting areas. So we do a lot of vanilla research, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
And I'm Jean-François Simons. I'm responsible for EMEA of the Aviation ISAC, as well as chair of the European Council of ISAC. So let's jump into the subject immediately, and I would start with Brian. In fact, how did Boeing realize the importance to engage with the White Hackers community, and how did you set up your vulnerability disclosure program?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So for the Boeing Company, always focus on safety of our products, and also the security and resiliency of our products. And so when we think about how we engineer our products, we spend a lot of time in our development cycles, in our build cycles, our factory environments. And so we dedicate a lot of our engineering resources into making sure we get it right from a design perspective, understanding adversity and threat of our platforms during those cycles, which can be very long. They can be multi-year, sometimes 10, 15-year long cycles. And so Boeing has had a focus on security and resiliency of our product during development and our build process. But as important is the operations of our products. And so Boeing has looked at how do we optimize against a dynamic cyber threat? How do we optimize and partner not only with our customers like Deneen, but also with our regulators, with our government partners and stakeholders, and with the ethical research community, academia. And so we looked at how we were structured back in 2018, 2019. We lacked a consistent enterprise-wide VDP. And so we got a lot of feedback from researchers trying to do the right thing. Hey, we don't know who to talk to. We send an email. I think originally it was actually a fraud email was the title of the where we sent people back 2016, 2017. If they had concerns about our cyber issues with the Boeing Company. And so we thought about what's the right way to engage ethical researchers trying to do the right thing. And so in 2019, we created our first iteration, our version 1 of our vulnerability disclosure program, and launched that in the fall of 2019. and structured it with our partners in the aviation ecosystem. So we actually pulled together a team across all of the certificate holders within aviation, so Airbus, our folks over in Dassault, Rolls-Royce, GE, et cetera. I think there were 8 or 9 companies that all got together and talked about what are we trying to get out of our VDPs? What's the structure that we want to see? We wanted to make it consistent across the aviation ecosystem for researchers to engage. Not Airbus has a process, Boeing has a process. It's completely different. My expectations for interaction are going to be different. And so we spent about a year working to synchronize our VDPs across the industry. And then launched. And so I think the good part about that was the aviation companies have a consistent approach to carrot and a stick, right? Do we incentivize researchers, consistently? Are we doing the right things, making sure that we're not seeking retribution for things, that we're open and fostering that level of communication and collaboration? So our initial VDP was really about scope, and so we're very clear that it's not only Boeing IT infrastructure, but it's also our products. And then also, what does the interaction need to look like? Laying out those constraints in rules of the road, if you will. If you're going to engage with Boeing, here are the things that we want to see from researchers. Here's what researchers should expect from us. How long is it going to take us to make contact with you? What's the consistency of how we're going to interact over that time frame? And so that was launched in 2019. Got some feedback that, hey, there were some things that we probably want to change, and so we've worked a Researcher Hall of Fame. For those that go out and take a look at the Boeing VDP, we have 3 researchers that are in our Hall of Fame right now, and I'll talk later about at least 2 of those. And then the other thing was Safe Harbor, which is a good piece. It was really implied in the original VDP, but if you're interacting with us and doing the right thing, Boeing's not going to come after you legally, right? Essentially is what the Safe Harbor element of the VDP is. And so it was a good step forward. We continue to look at our VDP and make it better based on feedback from folks that are using it.
And Deneen, how did it go for you?
Yeah, so United Airlines was one of the first commercial airline that started their what at that time was a bug bounty program. So if you think about what Brian just said, as a commercial aviation operator, we have a responsibility to keep planes safe and airworthy, but it's not the responsibility for us to take that. We work with the OEMs to make sure and use their processes and their approaches to make sure that the actual asset is safe. The bug bounty program initially started for United.com, so our digital-facing assets that were customer-facing, and was really a contest-based type of program. You find a bug, you get some miles. Who doesn't want to get free miles, free flights out of miles that way? So I think it started really as a way to supplement some of the application security programs that might have not been as mature and operationalized. So we wanted to engage, at that time the team wanted to engage with the research community, cast the widest net to make sure that all the bases were covered. Since then, we've evolved the program now to from a bug bounty to a responsible vulnerability disclosure. Instead of just United.com, we've cast a wider net, and now it's the entire United internet-facing digital asset. So whatever that is, we are able to do that. And then you're able to engage with that. We also started to figure out how do we work with our trusted third parties, software services, to make sure that if something is found, we're able to incentivize the researchers and then also pass that information along, but still reward those folks that are finding those issues. Because if you think about the way a commercial aviation operator, their websites are, there's yes, we do a lot of internal development, but we also rely on a lot of third-party services, and that becomes a little bit complicated. So we're working to figure out how do we make sure that we have transparency across our whole digital ecosystem, and when researchers are finding issues, they're rewarded within our construct. So that's what we're working towards now. I think as we move forward, we're tweaking the program. We're really taking feedback as well from the researchers, what's working for them, what's not. We used to host the platform ourselves, so similar to what Brian said, it was just an email, and the team was tracking on Excel spreadsheets, right, around what this is, and when do they, if they would meet the SLA to pay the researcher out or not. So we've then, kind of did our own internal tooling, and then we've also now, we're on a platform, and we started to add in things like, like just the basic controls for, top tens and things like that, the basic risk assessment, so we're all working in the same framework. But it's still evolving, and we're still, getting a lot of value out of the program, and, it's a continuous journey here at United.
Do you invite some of your provider to join your bug bounty, and they would fund part of your bug bounty?
Yeah, we so if there's a service provider that there's an issue that's found, we'll kind of manage that vulnerability process for them, because a lot of them may not have vulnerability disclosure programs on their own. So we kind of facilitate that through our process, and we'll pay them for United. Because again, the whole goal is to reduce risk in the aviation ecosystem, and who cares if it's somebody else, it still comes off as United, right? So we want to do the right thing.
Thank you. Ken, I remember you from InfoSec UK and a presentation of some case. How did you join vulnerability disclosure program in aviation? How did it start?
Well, we'll probably go back about 5 years now, and we took a punt on an aviation boneyard, which had some airplanes, and we rang them up and said, what happens to them? I said, well, they get carved up for spares. And I said, okay, so they're never flying again. Asked if we gave you some money for the fuel and your time, would you let us have a go at them? Because they're never going to fly again, right? So that got us started, made some interesting discoveries early on. But things really accelerated during the COVID lockdowns. That kind of changed everything. A lot of airplanes were retired earlier than expected. The planes we had access to historically were 15 to 20 years old. So we're seeing really, really old examples of airplanes that had reached the end of their useful life. So they didn't really represent the state of the art today. But during those lockdowns, a lot of newer planes got retired, and the boneyards in the UK got backed up. They didn't have enough people to take enough and part out the planes. So that got us some access to some newer technologies. And that's where we started making really interesting discoveries and started going through the process of disclosing those vulnerabilities. That experience, I think in a word, has been variable. There's beacons of excellence out there, and I'd like to compliment Boeing and United for their vulnerability disclosure programs. They really work. They work really well. They've matured brilliantly. But some of our experiences across other parts of industry have been quite different. Some have responded well, but not really kept us up to date. And others, it's been a bit shouting into the void. So we've had to engage with other parts of industry to help us open up and have those meaningful conversations so we can share vulnerabilities that we found, so things can be fixed and planes can be made a little safer.
Is there anything special with the aviation industry? Because I think to maritime as well, but is there something very specific to the aviation industry?
Yeah, the big thing for me, it was a huge learning point. Again, I'm a light aircraft pilot, so I knew some of the systems, but I didn't know how they were used, the standard operating procedures that sat behind them. But the big difference for me was learning about certification. That was a really, really important point. So I think a lot of the troublesome disclosures of the past have been with researchers that didn't particularly understand how the industry operated. And a great example of that would be a vulnerability. You find it. Most researchers would start a clock of 90 days ticking at that point. Google Project Zero do it. And after 90 days, people feel it's reasonable to disclose. You can't do that in aviation. Reason being is it might take a day or two or a week to fix your code, but it could take up to 2 years to recertify that code. And that's a real learning point. And I think anyone who's finding vulnerabilities in aviation, anyone who's disclosing vulnerabilities in aviation, you can't just go publish on 90 days. Take time, work with the organization, listen to the pains that they're experiencing, and figure out a way that you can disclose in a coordinated fashion at the right time.
Danine, I saw you nodding, but what would be for you the difference of aviation?
Similar to the comments that Ken made. I mean, you have to understand that, people always ask why doesn't your vulnerability disclosure program cover your aircraft or on-air systems? Those planes are in service, and the number one factor that we take always is safety, right? So we don't want to encourage anything while that plane is in service. And it also is, planes are expensive, not just to buy, to operate. So if you do find something on an aircraft, like we invited everybody out there, right? If you found something, just by reasonable cause, we would take that out. We would take that aircraft out of service, right? And and then maybe there would be ripple effects of the fleet, until so there's a lot of considerations that you have to think about while the way commercial aviation operates. And you have to also consider that there's much more than just the initial component that you may be looking at. Those systems, the controls, the physical controls, the operating procedures, the safety checklist that you go through to operate a plane safely. Those are it's just an enormous effort, and has been in aviation for the past 5 years that commercial aviation has been an industry. That's the way we think about things. So it's not IT. It's absolutely not IT, and I think people just need to realize that.
And Brian, how do you see it about testing the product and the complexity of connected product, etc.?
Yeah, I think both Deneen and Ken hit on a lot of the key points with the uniqueness of aviation. The number one for us within Boeing, we created internally our ability to triage these as they came in. And so we have a technical council that looks, so think about engineering, our supplier management folks, because a lot in our commercial business is going to be, hey, we need to go back and talk to GE and Collins, et cetera, about things that were brought to us. And so there is a time for the initial discovery of what the researcher believed they had found. And then there's the analysis on the Boeing side. And like Deneen said, number one is safety, right? So we need to, with velocity, find out if this is truly a safety issue to our fleets, and if so, we're grounding airplanes, right? And so that's the number one thing that we look at. But that takes time. So there's engineering rigor that needs to go in to understand, did we not only find a susceptibility, but when we look at the architecture of the airplane and the ecosystem that the airplane operates in, is this truly a vulnerability? Can someone get to it, and can someone have effect on the airplane? And so as we work through that, there is a back and forth with the researcher that typically happens. Very often a researcher will be able to get their hands on an automobile or on a medical device, and they have the totality of the architecture. They can probably go online and talk about security procedures and those things. But with an airplane, minus the COVID boneyarding effect that happened over those couple years, there really isn't the ability for an in-service configuration of a commercial airplane to be out there and available for researchers to go truly understand, is what I found on a subcomponent, is that really an issue or not, right? So that takes time, and there's a dialogue that happens, and there's a trust relationship that's built between the OEMs and the ethical researchers as we go through and talk about defense in depth that may be around that, procedural things that may be around that. Not that we're not going to fix it, but here's our take on what you found and what we're going to go do about it. So there's those discussions, and then Ken hit on the timing piece. Ken, we'll talk about it in a minute, but he had to wait over a year from when he brought something to Boeing to when he could publish. And so I thank him for his patience, because a lot of researchers would have been super frustrated having to wait a year, but he understood that what this means to the traveling public, what it means to what the Boeing company and certification has to happen and get over those hurdles before we can jointly talk about it in open press.
Right, and I'll just comment on like a non kind of, I'll say technical aspect, but when you think about it, planes are cool, right? They're sexy, they're media attention, right? One thing, if you see in the news right now, you see, oh my gosh, this happened on this runway, and those are, not to downplay things, but those are everyday happenings in aviation. The public doesn't understand. So as soon as something like little gets picked up, it's not like there's a bug in, like Microsoft Outlook or whatever that, people are like, oh my gosh, the world's going to end. But there's some allure around aviation, and it gets kind of like that. The narrative kind of goes out of control very fast. So it's very important for us to be responsible about what the risk actually is and how to manage that. So it's accurately portrayed in the greater understanding in the public.
So you put in place your vulnerability disclosure program, you sold it to the management, but what's the result of it? Do you have some example of use case that you would say like, yes, it's really true that we detected vulnerabilities and mitigated the vulnerabilities? Could you give us some examples? Well, I'll start with Brian.
Sure, and I'll talk about two of them. Within our VDP, like I talked about at the beginning, we have 3 Hall of Fame researchers on there, folks that did the right thing, worked with the Boeing company, and we went and fixed something in our ecosystem. And so we'll talk about, the first one is a tool called the Onboard Performance Tool, or OPT. Think about it as an app on an EFB, so an electronic flight bag. Typically iOS-based, but they can be Android or Windows-based, but probably 95% of them are iOS-based. There was Pentest Partners, so Ken's company came to Boeing in, I believe it was 2020,
Yep.
Right? The fall of 2020, and had done some research around the OPT tool and some of the security features on the back end of the data, the ability to properly secure configuration and prevent manipulation of data on the back end with an EFB that potentially didn't have the proper mobile device management and other security features around it. And so we looked at it. There was time spent for the first couple months. Let me take a step back. So the first part that we tried to do is within 72 hours, get back to the researcher to say, hey, we got your information. We're going to assess. We'll get back to you with additional information, with proof of concept code, those types of things. But give us some time, and then we try to set a frequency up when we'll get back with the researchers every couple weeks. Is our intent to do that? And so we went to PTP and said, hey, got it. We're gonna go look at it. And so we went and spent the next few months going through, having them explain what they found, having an iteration of technical meetings to dive into, what version was it. It happened to be a Windows version of the tool that they found it on. So trying to understand the nuances of what they found, their proof of exploit code, went through, validated that it was something that we wanted to go fix within the OPT tool. Worked through our software development processes, went through all of our formal release processes, and then went through and released that onboard performance tool. Version 4.7 was the fixed version of it, and deployed that. Like I said before, that took us about a year. Could we have done better? Maybe, right? But it was really wanted to understand the impact, wanted to understand, number one, is this a safety issue, right? The first couple weeks of doing this, we brought that joint team together to include safety, to include our airplane programs, and said, hey, is this an issue of safety of flight? Because if it is, we need to do something right now. And we said, no, there's mitigating circumstances around what we found. We do not assess this as a safety issue. Talk to our regulators about it, right? So there's a whole process that we go through when we do that. Publish the fix, and I think the best part for me was jointly released a statement with PTP. Not that we always have to do that, but I think it shows an OEM and a researcher jointly releasing, and there's always artistic, right? I don't like that word, you don't like that word. So we got into hours of meetings about which words we were using, but we jointly released something around, hey, this is what was found, this is the process we went through, and this is what we did about it. So I think a really good example of how our VDP worked. And the second one I'll use is ForeFlight. So ForeFlight is a general aviation application, also on the EFB, that's used mostly for flight planning. Like I said, within general aviation primarily. There was a Embry-Riddle. I don't know if is Kestrel here? I don't know if. I know he's at RSA. Kestrel Carlo, I think he's presenting this week at RSA, so if you have a chance, go see his presentation on this. But he found a data input weakness within ForeFlight, one of the industry standard data inputs, think about like ADS-B input into the application. There was some additional filtering that was needed on that data coming into the application. So this was an example, and this was fairly recent. This was brought to the Boeing company in December of 2022. We turned around and fixed it within ForeFlight at the end of January, so less than 60 days from start to finish with that application. So another really good example of a researcher coming to us, working through the VDP with velocity, us fixing the application, going back to him verifying that it was fixed. And he said, I'm going to go look for something else now. So, which is good, because I think that's what it's all about, is that trusted community really looking for what is the best for the flying public and for general aviation around how do we make the most secure and resilient products that we can. And as threat changes, there's always that iterative nature of what we need to do together in the ecosystem.
And at United, do you have like example of success stories?
Well, I think ours are a little bit different because, again, it's around our digital products. So United.com, our mobile app, where consumers are actually managing their flights. We do every once in a while get a something that's like, oh wow, and you get those excited. The researcher had to really work hard to find it, right? They get their $1 million mile payout, and that's really cool. But a lot, just like any other organization, I don't have a perfect development happening, right? There's always something, that was missed, right? So what we're trying to do with our VDP program is make sure that as we gather that data and get those submissions, whether it be, something as common as an unauthenticated API, right, that the developer just didn't do, right? How do we go back and map that to our policies, our standards, and then controls? And then we figure out, why did that happen? Was it a process breakdown? Was our control not operating effectively? Did the person just kind of ignore us, right? Like, how do we mistake proof that? So that's what I'm really challenging my team on, is to make sure that when we do engage, or when the security researchers do engage, they're working on that stuff that is never seen before, right? It's not it's 0 days, or it's something that's very, very kind of interesting. It's not an unauthenticated API, broken, session management, broken authentication or improper session management, or SQL injections, all that basic stuff. Like, I want to get rid of that, and that's because, that is my responsibility, to have a really good, strong application security and secure development program, and then I want the researchers to help me find all that stuff that is new and interesting and different, right? So it's a little bit different. I love this. I love hearing the stories and working with these guys around some of the other product stuff, though.
And Ken, do you have also other examples?
I wish all the disclosures we've done were as seamless as those that we've walked through with Boeing. It's not consistent across the whole of industry yet. It's definitely improving, but there are still a number of organizations that we've disclosed vulnerabilities to that they're just not mature in their disclosure program yet. They've got, I think, some learning to go. And I think also, perhaps, maybe a little burnt by some of the previous media attention to cool plane hacking. So instead of embracing the researcher as a friend and someone to help, someone to make things better, there's still, I think, with some organizations, a degree of, perhaps they're antagonized. I'm not sure. It can be very difficult to hear that your baby has got security flaws, something you've spent years developing and has got problems. It's very difficult to receive that culturally. But I think those in the enlightened space certainly appreciate there's a lot to be done from working with security researchers. I can think of 7 vulnerabilities that we've found in electronic flight bag apps, or EFBs themselves. And of those, 4 were well received, well responded to, fundamentally fixed. 1 ended up in quite a difficult discussion, and 1 we still haven't had any response back from the vendor, despite the aviation community actually trying to reach out to the vendor on our behalf and give them a bit of a kick and say, no, you really need to listen. So it's variable, but it is improving. And I think many aviation organizations would do well to follow some of the examples set by United and Boeing.
but I'm just bouncing on what you just stated. So, as a researcher, if you don't get an answer, what tool do you have? Because it's also a little bit frustrating. Okay. You find something, it's your baby, you're just like, wow, that's kind of cool, and there is no reaction.
So, aviation is about safety, right? I'm a pilot, I'm a member of the traveling public. It's about confidence in what we're doing. No one wants to go out and spook the traveling public. My wife is a terrible flyer. The last thing I want to do is make her any less likely to fly. In that case, if you're stonewalled, try and engage with parts of the community that can help you. So, for example, the Aviation ISAC is extremely helpful at brokering conversations. There are regulators, so the FAA can be resorted to. They will try and help if you get nowhere. The very, very last place I would go, and I'd think very, very carefully about this, is I might consider a trusted journalist. Sometimes that's what the organization needs to be woken up to realize there's a reputational impact that's not just fighting with the researcher. But I'd express extreme caution about that path. There's something about hacking planes that social media seems to go loopy about. As soon as someone says plane hacking, just the world lights up. Journalists misunderstand. Speculation is rife. So you have to be so very, very careful. And just to dispel one really important myth, right? You don't hack an airplane sat in your seat in coach. It just doesn't work like that. Right? It's the network. The cabin is considered a dirty network. That's where we stream stuff and do our email. It's considered a dirty environment, right? There is very, very strong segregation between that and anything to do with flight safety. So you do not hack a plane sat back in the cabin. It just doesn't work like that. Real caution with media. Tweet something and the world blows up. So just be really, really careful. And the last place I just want to touch on briefly, because it made me so mad when I watched it, was the Netflix MH370 documentary. Don't know if you've seen that one yet. Episode 2. The first episode makes a lot of sense. Second episode, I shouted at my TV. I don't get cross, I don't get mad when I'm watching stuff. But what annoyed me about it is it was so poorly researched and so speculative. The problem is that the world latches onto that. So they suggested that someone had got down into the eBay, the avionics bay, and done some stuff with a laptop. How they did that, I do not know. The connectors they were using just don't exist in the real world, and what they were displaying on screen was a joke. It was a DNS exfiltration attack. I was like, but that's got nothing to do with ARINC 629 flight control protocols that run in the eBay. So just to conclude is the world has this funny thing about aviation and cybersecurity, so please express extreme caution. Work with vulnerability disclosure programs, work with industry if you can't get the response that you need, and allow industry to take it forward, and get people like Boeing on side to help you with that if need be.
I'm just bouncing on the media discussion, because Deneen was raising it as well, and it's true that aviation and media, it's always like a high attention, like, that flight had turbulence. It's like, yeah, it happens sometimes. So how do you react with the media? How do you interact with the media? Maybe Brian.
Yeah, it's like Ken said, with making sure that, because words matter, and making sure that we get the facts out is something that we as an industry continue to strive for. I think the Aviation ISAC has been huge with us. It gives you a way to communicate consistently with, I think, 100 partners, 100 plus now, across the globe. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we get information consistently to the ISAC. The ISAC's another way that we get incoming, too, from the researcher community. It's just another funnel that helps us there. The other big piece for us is making sure when these types of things come in, that all of our stakeholders are aware. The last thing we want to do is have an article come out in Wired magazine, or pick the magazine, the cyber magazine out there, and our regulator or our government partners see it for the first time there and not with us. So we've really leaned forward, and it was a bit uncomfortable for probably a year or two as we were building those relationships and trust around, hey, things are still forming, but I'm going to come to you and tell you what's going on. And so we utilize this group called the ACI within the US, the Aviation Cyber Initiative. So within the ACI, we have representation from the DoD, from DHS, and from Homeland Security, and from the FAA. And so it's a way that, and these are cyber people, and so we can talk to them. Here's what got brought to us. Here's what we're doing about it. We'll get back to you with a formal response here as soon as we can, but we at least wanted to give you a heads up. We don't want the first time a regulator or a government partner sees something is in media. And so that's been pretty successful for us. Have built trust there, and then also internationally, working with our international regulators, getting with the EASA and others very soon after things happen, just to let them know what's happening. And that's really gone a long way with building trust with Boeing. And so in this environment, I think that open communication with that trusted group has helped us shape the narrative around what reality really is, right? There's the spin that may be happening in social media, but here's what we know, here's what we're doing about it, and being open kimono with them, like I said, was a bit vulnerable when the relationship started, but it's really built trust and has given us the ability, I think, to make sure that we're all on the same page as these stories develop, and then we finally get to what the truth is, and then I think partnering with the researchers is always best. They don't have to accept our input, but seeing that, I think for both parties, seeing a jointness in the way that we talk about things is a win-win for both the researcher and the OEM.
In my past experience, I remember a relation with the press when at Brussels Airlines we had some breach, and non-so-ethical researcher immediately contacted the press. And I realized I was absolutely not ready because we were informed just like 1 hour before it was going on air. And I was wondering, how do you prepare Deneen for that? How do you prepare? Do you have a lot of interaction with media?
So we get in that situation as well too, whether it's an issue that's found with United that a researcher made United.com or a mobile app or whatever that may disclose to the press, or even one of our partners. So you guys might be familiar with the Commute Air incident that happened in early January, I believe, that exposed a misconfiguration of a web server, exposed the TSA no-fly list, right? So that Commute Air, they fly exclusively for United. The folks that are on the planes wear United uniforms. The United Express is on the, so people think it's United as well too. So we work very closely to prepare for these types of situations, right? Around what response and what we want to say and how we want to say it. So we have, of course we have holding statements and things like that, but we are constantly having dialogue based on what is happening in the industry around okay, if this is happening in this sector or at these companies, it could potentially happen to us or one of our partners, how would we respond? So we're constantly updating kind of our response activities, not only from a technical or process standpoint, but also from a communication standpoint. So, I have dedicated people on our comms team that are cyber crisis communicators, right? So they understand the nuances and how to interact. And even with the security researchers, right? Communication with a security researcher is different than with a reporter, is different with a policymaker. So, we do engage with the security research community. We hold, workshops and different sessions, right? And updating them on what we're doing and what's going on and feedback they have for us, right? So we're constantly developing a 360 view of the narrative. So it's not just that particular incident. It's, we may have an issue or an event and this is good or bad, or this is exaggerated or not exaggerated, whatever messages we're communicating. But we're also saying in totality, this is what is happening. So that's how we try to handle it. And again, evolving all the time because things change every day here.
Thank you. I have a point as well for Ken and Brian about certification and how long it takes to recertify. Is there any initiative to speed the process up, maybe at the regulation level to speed things up? I do know that in Europe they are reviewing the certification cycles and trying to harmonize it because it's different between countries, but I don't know if there is some improvement foreseeing in the coming years.
So yeah, it's a discussion with our regulators, both our regulator, the FAA for Boeing, and then our partner regulators that the velocity at which we can understand threat and then make a change, but make a change to safety certified software that doesn't have unintended consequences. So we're going through the processes around risk assessment, around how can we automate things like model-based engineering, things that will help accelerate our ability to both make the change, but also understand the impact from a safety certification of that airplane. And so there isn't a date for, hey, when are we going to get to X turnaround? But we are making progress, and it is the vision of regulators and OEMs to drive that critical path down as much as possible.
Thank you very much. I see that we are almost approaching before wrapping up. I would like to know, like, what would be the main takeaway you would like the audience to take with them from this session? I'll start with Deneen, sorry.
No, that's okay. We didn't go through our regular slides. So I think the main takeaway really is, as you think about, where you're at in the maturity of your systems development programs and product security programs, how does the vulnerability disclosure program match that, right? You can't have an immature product security or systems development framework and expect to go full-blown VDP, right? You have to take, it's a process, and you have to understand that, because the ultimate value that you want to get out of it is making sure that you are casting the widest net, that you have people that are in a trusted community that will look for flaws or vulnerabilities that you may not have because of your design processes and things like that. So I think it's really around understanding where you're at, and that as an organization, and then aligning your VDP program and realizing over time it'll change, and those outcomes will kind of generate more value over time.
Thank you very much. Brian?
I think about it from two lenses. If you're in this room and you work for a company that doesn't have one, get one, right? So it's surprising to me the amount of companies that operate not only within aviation but broader that just don't have a VDP. So number one is do one. There's a lot of great examples and a lot of help out there to how you should structure a vulnerability disclosure program. Number two, from the company lens, getting a workflow behind the VDP. So the ability for you to understand what this really means to your product or your IT infrastructure, so it doesn't have to be ad hoc every time it comes in the door. Getting consistency around the stakeholders in your organization, and even ones that we don't initially think about, like legal, and we talked about comms. All of those pieces are supply-based POCs. Getting all of that structured so we can execute with speed has been something that has helped Boeing, which, as you can imagine, is a very bureaucratic, 160,000 person company. So trying to do anything with speed is always a challenge. So getting that structure built behind the VDP has been critically important also. And then on the researcher side, I think understanding the VDP process for the companies that you're dealing with, understanding the expectations, and then giving feedback. We know our VDP is not perfect. We know the process isn't perfect. So getting feedback in a constructive manner from the researchers is something that can help us all get better and help us all fix our products with that changing cyber threat.
Ken, would you add something?
From the perspective of a researcher, probably three things. Is number one, make it easy. Right? Publish security.txt, for example. Make it really easy for the researcher to get through to the right person. It's often the organizational structure makes it hard to get the right information to the right person. Just make it easy. Second thing is remember to communicate. Often you receive something, great, and you go off and work on it. But someone forgets to tell the researcher that you're working really hard on this. So just tell them, and tell them how often you update them. And the third thing is receive it with grace. It can be very hard to hear that something that you've built isn't perfectly cyber secure. But actually that researcher's probably invested a lot of time, maybe quite a bit of money, in finding a vulnerability that they've given to you as a gift. So receive that with some grace. So make it easy, communicate, and receive it with grace.
Thank you very much. Only 5 minutes left, and I have so much questions, so I'm going to try to squeeze them all together. In case we have somebody here in the audience that said, like, I'd love to do some research on aviation. What would be your advice? And also, how do you see them growing? Do you have your own research internally? Do you mainly base on that? Or do you have like mainly external partners? What would it be like? I would start with Deneen.
Yeah, so we, at United, we have a red team that does our enterprise, continuous assessments and pen testing. And then we also have an an aircraft cybersecurity team. So we're doing constant risk assessments and working with our partners like Boeing and Airbus and other suppliers to assess that. We also use partners as well too, because we know we can't do everything ourselves. And with the 750,000 open cybersecurity jobs in the U.S. right now, there's just not enough talent to do what we need to do. There's different mechanisms and approaches that we take internally to make sure our products, our digital products and services, as well as our aircraft are safe, and we're continuously assessing them. For anybody who wants to, get into that, I would just say, do it. Start to look at the companies that do have robust VDPs. If you're start to look and understand how those programs work and engage. So that's the best way.
What about Boeing? If I would like to join the VDP, what would you advise me to do?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good forums. There's the Aerospace Aviation Village forums that are in DEF CON Black Hat. So there's a lot of, there's the Aviation ISAC. So there's a lot of groups that are out there at events like RSA that have the insight and the connections to help people get connected with either researchers or companies or academia. We partner with a lot of academic institutions too around aviation security. And so there are avenues, there are proponents out there of ethical, trusted research. So getting connected with those people are important. And then, we, like Deneen, we're looking for good people internally and with partner companies too, to go off and understand the strength of controls around our ecosystem. And so we at Boeing I wouldn't classify it as a red team. I'd call it more purple because they're not completely gloves off, externally kind of mindseted team. But we do have pen testing that we do as a consistent measure for us within our engineering and sustainment processes within Boeing. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Ken, accept the answer, come and work for me. What would be your advice?
So how do you get into aviation cyber in terms of finding vulnerabilities? Well, you've got to go and break some stuff, but make sure it's your stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Don't go hacking someone else's airplanes, right? That's not legal. It's highly dangerous. You could end up with an airplane being retired. That would be really, really bad. So you can buy components from eBay. You can often find LRUs, line replaceable units, that you can go and do some basic learning on. They're not cheap, but they do come up from time to time. There are other learning platforms around too. So go and explore, but make sure it's legal and it's not somebody else's airplane.
Thank you very much. Outside of Black Hat, I would say Aviation Village, he's here as well. So I would invite you to visit them. They're at the sandbox area, if I'm correct. I'm going right there afterwards. If you have questions for our panelists, you are free to engage them maybe at the exit of the room or while they are at RSA. I guess the Aviation Village might be a good place where you might find them. I thank you very much for your time, and I thank the panelists for that very interesting discussion. Thank you.